Through meditation, you can observe your thoughts and your feelings and the sensations of your body. But who is this observer? Is it your real self or your true self? Is it some form of non-dual awareness? And how do you feel when you experience what's going on in your mind and your body? Who is this observer self? Well, sit back and relax, and let's discuss. Well, last time I checked, my name was Russ Rapp, and this is my YouTube channel about nothing, or no thing. So who is this observer self? Is it you? Is it your higher self? Or some form of non-dual awareness? When you meditate or just simply observe your thoughts and your feelings and what's happening in your body, sometimes what can happen is that you get a sense that you become separate from what's going on internally. And so you see yourself as a separate self, and the you who you once thought you were, when you're identified with your thoughts and your feelings, that becomes something that's happening almost like an object to your higher subject. And so what you start to see is that, it's a good way to see that what you thought you were when you identify with the story of your thoughts is no longer really, doesn't have as much weight. But who is that subject that's watching you as an object? That's a great question. And I think what happens is when people are learning about non-duality or meditating, they start to get this separation from what they used to think was part of who they were, is now become something that's an other or an object. And so what can happen is that you start to believe that you are this subject that's watching you as a person in a body, thinking and feeling. And so what I think can happen is that you start to identify with the observer. And when that happens, if you notice that most of what's being observed, it's almost like a hyper-awareness of what's happening internally, but the focus is on you. And so this observer, in a sense, is really just focused on what's happening inside of you. And in a way, I see it almost as a mind trick to think that it's some sort of separate self from who you are, this separate self that you're identified with. It's almost like splitting yourself into two different, an object and a subject, but meanwhile, it's all the same separate self. And I know this gets really confusing. This is probably the 12th take I've made of this video because it's hard to explain and you can't really understand it intellectually. You can only experience it. And so right now I'm feeling a sense of anxiety in my gut a little bit because I want to be able to communicate this to you, and having so many tries of making this video, and my thoughts are really just streaming. Whatever is popping in my head is really coming out of my mouth right there, which adds a little bit to the anxiety because typically I'm the kind of person that wants to think through what I have to say before I say it. But what I notice with this observer self is that oftentimes when you objectify your thoughts and your feelings, you start to see them as an other. In that moment, that space of meditation, or whatever you want to call it, that observing space, you get that sense that it is an other. But 5 minutes down the line, when you are no longer in that space, you start to identify with the thoughts and the feelings, and you don't really get that sense of observer self. And so then at that point you start to feel like you've lost something or you've done something wrong. And what I've noticed when I observe my thoughts and my feelings, I get a sense that it's some sort of non-judgmental thing, but what ends up happening is I start to see what's happening inside my thoughts and my feelings, and it's something that I maybe don't want to be thinking about. It's negative thoughts or repetitive thoughts, or maybe have anger and anxiety, or something's wrong internally that maybe I don't like, and becoming hyper aware of that almost accentuates what's happening. And so the one thing I just wanted to make you consider as you're watching this video is, when you get this sense of an observer watching your thoughts and your feelings, recognize that it changes. Recognize that it sometimes you feel like an observer, sometimes you feel identified with the self. But my feeling is that it's all the separate self. Because what's happening is, it's still coming from a perception of you. And ultimately, the non-dual awareness isn't tied to this body. And so that observer isn't necessarily concerned, the ultimate observer isn't necessarily concerned with what's happening with you directly. It is, but it isn't. And so it's also aware of what's happening with this coffee mug. It's aware of this ring. It's aware of the curtains and the bookcase. And it's not a necessary, because we think of in terms of how we see and how we touch and taste in our five senses, but in a way objects also have a communication as well. And so when we start to think of this separate observer and it's all focused on ourselves, I think that's where we need to take a step back and say, you know, maybe this is just another trick of the separate self in order to make you be identified with it, because ultimately you're switching the identification with your thoughts and your feelings to this observer self. Because a non-dual awareness would obviously observe what's happening with you, but everything else all at the same time. And it's not something that you can intellectualize. So the moment that you start to intellectualize what's happening internally, that's a clue to show you that it's some sort of identification with your separate self. So with that, I'm going to leave you. If you want to find some more meditation videos and really sit in a calming way and observe your thoughts and everything else that's going on around you, a mindful meditation, I welcome you to that. There's tons of videos on YouTube you can watch, and you can start to get a sense of maybe what I'm talking about here. So I just want to wish you peace. It's been real and unreal.